During this online module, we're going to talk a little bit about the professional responsibilities that we have as part of the helping process in being a professional helper. The first part is being able to understand why we need guidelines. For this week, you've been asked to read a set of standards that have been put forth by the National Association of Human Services, and we need to understand the intent of these. As you read through them, really understand that it's our responsibility to care for individuals who are oftentimes in very vulnerable positions. Not only does this make them vulnerable to situations and systems, but also to the manipulation that can happen based on who they seek help from. The guidelines that we have should be seen as sort of these guidelines or rules that we should follow. They will guide ethical dilemmas and guide those difficult decisions as to whether or not and how we can engage in services. Additionally, these guidelines are ultimately intended to be a source of protection for both the helpee who's receiving services and also for ourselves as professional helpers. These guidelines will let us know what we can and can't do, in addition to being able to lay out clearly our roles and responsibilities as part of being the helper. As you proceed with your educational and career advancement, you'll be able to really fine tune the set of standards that you will follow. These that we read for the week are for human service professionals. In addition, there are National Association of Social Work Professions, professional counselors, and psychology and counseling psychology standards that may be of interest to you. Some of these standards that we have are common across the boards and not really related to the specific discipline. Some of them might include the fact that, hey, as a helper, I'm going to be aware of my own needs and I'm not going to do something that's going to put the helpee's expense at risk. We've talked a lot about that already. Another common standard found in these standards is that I will understand and appreciate the power of this helping role and ultimately use it for the benefit and care of the helpee. Again, it sort of reiterates that this is a vulnerable population and we could impose our power and privilege in a way that could put them in more risk or in danger. So we should be aware of the fact that this power should be used to benefit the helpee. We should also understand that, hey, a common standard is knowing our limitations and not working outside of our scope of practice or of competence. I remember very often early on wanting to do things that I knew I didn't have the skill set to do. I had to be very mindful of being able to limit myself in what I opened up and knowing when and who I should refer to be able to get the needs met. An example is early on, I wasn't really trained in trauma, but I really wanted to talk about trauma with people that had their experience. Trauma is a very complex topic to touch, and we have to have the proper skill set and training to do so. So I'd be very mindful of the fact that I had my limitations then and there. Other standards are being able to understand that, hey, as you build up your skill set, approaches and techniques that you use should be done under the appropriate supervision. I may have an idea of what I think is effective. I read some literature on it, and when I try to implement it, it should be done under someone that has that experience. I should not be doing or trying things out that don't have evidence behind them, and I should not be doing them under the supervision of someone that has the qualified credentials. We should know that in addition to sort of knowing our limitations and scope of practice, we should be able to recognize that we can't be everything to everybody. I should understand that I should be able to seek supervision and consultation because that's critical to being able to grow my skill set, but also to be an effective helper to the person that I'm trying to work with. As you know, and as you'll talk about in other classes, these standards have really developed over time. And part of that is because there's been this changing dynamic of how helping is disseminated. So it probably is no surprise that as time evolves and as things progress, we will also adapt new standards that will be comprehensive about the new ventures that we're taking. For example, more recently, we are beginning to use technology to make our services more accessible. And the role that technology plays as adaptive and assistive needs to be developed in order to be able to be ethically focused on the benefit of the helpee. Not only confidentiality, but other standards that may evolve might come into play in future standards that will help us guide and give us these rules to follow. Other aspects of our professional responsibilities really continue to focus on the care of the helpee. These that we'll talk about a little today are going to be the informed consent, confidentiality, and focusing on, again, how we can maintain and build that professional relationship. So, what is an informed consent, right? I'm sure you've all gone to a clinic, to an agency, to a hospital, to somewhere to receive services, and hopefully we've been given an informed consent. We've been explained it, and we've agreed and signed to be able to be part of that treatment intervention program or service that's being offered. And when I do that, the informed consent really is a set of standards that the helpee is agreeing to abide by as part of that helping relationship. Now, it's probably no surprise that many of us have probably been given an informed consent, but it's been very wordy. Maybe it hasn't been clearly explained. And in order to get on with services that we are seeking, we'll sign and not really understand or fully comprehend what we're signing. So, you should be able to, when you're working in an agency, clearly understand the informed consent. You'll get to know it, you'll be able to understand the intricacies and the details of it, and hopefully be able to understand it enough so that you can relay that information to the helpee. Part of this is being able to really exude this transparency. And transparency from the start to the end of the helping process is critical. In other classes, you'll talk a little bit about sort of the mental health systems in the past and the lack of transparency and the lack of rights that people seeking services were never given. So we've learned that that is unethical, it can be much more harmful, and so your responsibility is to truly understand the informed consent and be able to relay that to the helpee. And part of this is going to be able to really maybe begin to be a dialogue piece about, hey, this is what the standards are of you being in services, right? You have to be on time for your appointments. You might have to pay some services. We have to understand the role of what I can do and what are within my limitations of that role, and ensuring that they are agreeable to entering this dynamic. In a sense, an informed consent is sort of a bill of rights that the client, the helpee, is given from the beginning of services, at the beginning of services, so that they can consent and abide by what the relationship is being formed on. So, as you begin to explore and maybe volunteer or are working in the field, maybe get your hands on an informed consent and look through it and see what parts are covered. Oftentimes, there'll be parts covered that really clarify the services that are being offered, if there are costs and how they should be paid, confidentiality, which we'll talk about in a bit, as well as the fact that they should have rights that they can terminate services if when possible. Again, this is very agency specific, and so there is no set that is required, but it is oftentimes developed by the program or the agency that is really trying to be transparent about what services and limitations they have. Like I said, oftentimes another part of the informed consent is going to be confidentiality. As we hopefully understand, part of being in this dynamic is going to require that the helpee open up and share some vulnerabilities and some things that maybe they're not proud of in this part of change, in this process of changing. So the helpee should feel like they can expect a relationship that's based on trust, on honesty, and hopefully a sense of safety for what they're about to share. If they have that, they hopefully will feel comfortable to disclose, and ultimately, we are also put on a position to hold this confidentiality both based on an ethical and legal standards. A lot of this, unfortunately, is not oftentimes clear cut. In this field, in my experience, there are rare times where that confidential dilemmas are black and white. Yes, as we'll talk about, some are black and white, but oftentimes that sense of confidentiality is something that we have to be very thoughtful and intentional in making that decision. What you should always try to do is when you feel that there is an ethical dilemma around sharing information or not, consult, right? Talk to a colleague who has experience, go to your supervisor, but really be mindful and again intentional in those situations so that you do not breach confidentiality. In being able to understand confidentiality, we should also understand that there are some limitations. as much as we want to set a space and have a relationship where we can really build a sense of trust and safety for that individual, for them to disclose vulnerabilities and things that they maybe otherwise would not, we also have to be very clear from the beginning the limitations of our confidentiality. This will vary a state to state, and sometimes agency to agency, and even demographic to demographic, right? All those policies that are agency specific. However, having said that, um, generally across the board in most of the United States, there are a set of limitations to confidentiality that are standards. The first one is if the helpee poses a danger to themselves. Now, this is critical. As you're talking to somebody from the beginning, even before you dive into a lot of sort of the nitty gritty or those details, we should be clear that, hey, I want you to know that despite the fact that I want to maintain most of the things we talk about confidential, there are going to be some limitations where I might have to talk to somebody or reach out to someone. I'll do that with you, I'll let you know, but legally, I don't need your consent to be able to do that. And one of those situations is if you tell me you're going to hurt yourself or harm yourself. In this sense, we're talking more specifically about if you're thinking about taking your life, but being very clear that when there's a danger, you have that right to be able to speak to somebody without the consent. In addition to that, another situation where you might have to break confidentiality and you should be clear from the front is if the helpee tells you that they are a danger to others. You're talking to someone and they say, you know what, I've really had it with my boss. I've got a gun and I'm going to go after them. You have a right to break that confidentiality and be able to inform after consultation, inform the authorities to be able to have that action to not have someone injured or hurt. In addition, in Wisconsin, when there is abuse, neglect of a child or an elderly person, we also have the right to protect those vulnerable populations and break confidentiality. So generally speaking, these are going to be the three times, right? Danger to themselves, danger to others, abuse, neglect of a child or elderly person, where you legally and ethically can break confidentiality so that you can protect the person or others. Again, there are going to be other areas where maybe there will be a lot of gray area. For example, hey, let's say that you read something in the newspaper, it's public information, right? Is that confidential anymore or not? And those are things that I would encourage you to continue to consult with your supervisor, but always make it a rule that when there is something that is of concern of whether or not it should remain confidential, seek consultation out. Too often have people made the abrupt judgment to say, no, this breaches or that this is a limitation of confidentiality when really it maybe did not get to that level. Not only is this sort of a legal issue, but also ethically, this could have a huge and detrimental impact on the relationship that you're building with your helpee. So, one, be clear about confidentiality, right? Because of its criticalness with being able to maintain or build and maintain a trusting and respectful relationship, and also be clear from the beginning the limits of confidentiality. Lastly, sort of maintaining this professional relationship with your professional responsibilities, we should always continue to remember things we've already discussed, right? We have to maintain our boundaries. As we've talked about with the types of loss of objectivity, it may be simple to blend boundaries, to cross boundaries, to identify too strongly, to have some of your own stuff come up. And part of our responsibility is to be able to make sure that we define those boundaries and maintain them through the helping process. And again, that really taps into sort of a lot of that direct personal involvement or those conflicts of interest that we talked about. So remember, in addition to sort of following the standards that are set forth by our discipline, and whatever that will be in the future, in addition to understanding confidentiality and informed consent, these are also things that we should continue to strive to do in order to be effective professional helpers.